We have 12 minutes.
I know. Tell me when I can start. Ready? Okay. Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen from the Capital Research Center, and we're going to go ahead and start because we're going to be very truncated due to the schedule here. I'm here to talk about the future of labor law and its change and how it's changing for the 21st century. And one of the things that's really amazing about this is an exciting time for this topic because we are in the middle of a technological revolution. This is like nothing we've ever seen before in our society. And at the same time, we have a political change. We have the political shift that occurred on election night between about 9 o'clock and 10:30 or so, when the one vision for America that a lot of people thought we were going to be heading toward became another vision for America. And those things actually tie in together. There's a reason that the employees at the Labor Department, that they contributed 99.4% of their contributions to Hillary Clinton over Donald Trump. And that's because we're talking about very different paths. People always say technology is changing society like never before, or they always say an election, the election is the most important one in my lifetime. Well, in that case, both those things were true. Why is it happening now? It's happening because in my view, there's a 20 or 30 year period that it takes new technology to be accepted into society, for the infrastructure to be created, whether you're talking about something like the telegraph lines or you're talking about the electrical grid. In this case, we're talking about everything that came out of the internet and the invention of the personal computer. Personal computer came in the late 70s, became part of the workplace in the 1980s, and of course remember the Macintosh ad from 1984, and the internet came in as part of the public consciousness around 1995. And so now it's 2017. And let me give you an example of how the power of computers increasing is something that can change society. How is it that this thing can appear out of nowhere and be life-changing for all of us? And that is that the power of computers, generally speaking, doubles about every 18 months or so, about every year and a half. That means that in 15 years, it's doubled 10 times. In 30 years, it's doubled 20 times. That's 1 million times. Doubling 20 times is about 1 million times. So a computer today is worth, in terms of its power, about 1 million times what it would have been 20 years ago. And there have always been people who have been concerned about the effect of technology on society and on creating jobs. There's a story that the Emperor of Rome in the 1st century was concerned that the column moving machine would take jobs away from the people who moved columns. Elizabeth I vetoed legislation that had to, or a patent, I should say, that had to do with a knitting machine, because there was a fear that it would take jobs away. This is something that has been true for technology throughout the centuries. There were the Luddites in the early 19th century who took their cue from the possibly mythical Ned Ludd, who was a worker who had destroyed a bunch of knitting machinery, and the idea was this was taking their jobs away. And of course there were the people during that era who took their sabot, their wooden shoes, and they threw them in the machinery, from which we get the term saboteur. So people were actually destroying machinery. This is where, by the way, the Communist Party has its roots in the Luddite movement. And but the fact is, though, that technology always created more jobs than it destroyed. In 1910, for example, the Bell system had 1 employee for every 578 calls. 1 employee for every 578 calls. By 1981, it was 1 employee for every 250,000 calls. Did the number of employees go down? No, the number of employees increased by a factor of 1,600%. So that's the way technology normally works. The problem is technology being stifled? Is the ability of technology to create new jobs being affected by all the rules and regulations, the restrictions that have been put in by various administrations, by Congress, by the bureaucracy over the last several decades? Hillary Clinton, in a 2015 speech, called for, first of all, she praised the idea of Uber and the effect of Uber and other technologies like that in creating jobs. But she said, we need to have fair pay and fair scheduling. We need to have paid family leave. We need to have earned sick days and child care, all provided by the employer. When you throw that in with $15 an hour minimum wage, which is really $18.50 or more when you figure in taxes, when you figure in mandatory benefits in cities. Is that a barrier that prevents us from being able to create new jobs? Remember, the labor laws that we're under now were created in the 1930s or earlier, and many of them to foster racial discrimination or to keep women out of the workforce. So we're talking about labor laws that represent a society that really doesn't exist anymore. And yet we have, under the Obama administration, they were attempting to put in, and these are things that would have happened with Hillary, very strong restrictions on overtime, on the idea that if you have a McDonald's franchise, if you're some immigrant family and you have a McDonald's franchise, you're the co-employer of all your employees with McDonald's Incorporated, the national headquarters, which would have put incredible burdens on these little businesses. And many other examples, changing the way that you can vote to have a union or not have a union, to get rid of the secret ballot with card check, to have the snap election so that employers can't really respond. That's the point we're at, I think, and we'll find out. We'll find out what happens now with the Trump administration. Do they get rid of these things? Do they change the path? One would hope they would. One would expect they would. The Labor Department employees certainly thought they would. Or is there going to be some backsliding? Or we're going to end up with some of these regulations staying in? And so now I'll turn it over to Mark.
Thanks, Steve. Well, that was a pretty good history. I have a question for all of you in the room. Who knows, who follows railroads? Does anyone like railroads around? When you grew up, you like railroads? Does anyone know what a fireman did on the railroad? What was a fireman's job on a railroad? Yes, sir.
Stoke the furnace.
Right, they shoveled coal and made sure that the steam engine was always stoked so the engine could move down the line. Well, steam engines were the mode of power for railroads in the 1900s and the turn of the centuries. But by 1930 and 1940, we introduced something called diesel motive power. Does anyone know what diesel motive power is? Do we think that diesel motive power needs a steam engine and a boiler? No, it doesn't. When do you think the last fireman was let go on the railroad, notwithstanding the fact that every single motive power on railroads in freight and passenger transportation was a diesel locomotive from 1960 on? When did the last fireman lose his job?
2006.
Pretty close, pretty close. It was about 1987 when the unions finally capitulated on a union contract saying that a fireman did not need to be part of a railroad crew on an engine that had no boiler, had no coal, and had no shovel. So technology has been something that the unions have opposed because technology by definition disrupts industries. And organized labor has not liked disruptions and they have not liked technology. In fact, I would suggest that the most important element of technology that labor unions are now confronted with is voluntarism in the workplace. Workers in America are adhering to voluntary institutions. As Samuel Gompers once said, the founder of the AFL, he said, workers of America adhere to voluntary institutions. Anything else is a menace to their rights. And the workers of America are adhering to Samuel Gompers' advice, and the technology they're using is voting for voluntarism in America's workplaces. 28 states now have right-to-work laws that simply say this: you have the right to join a union, to participate in a union any way you want, but you cannot be compelled as a condition of employment to pay dues or fees to get or keep a job. That's pretty neat technology. Freedom in the workplace, voluntarism. Union officials object to technology, they always have. Because as Steve mentioned, you know, if we have a machine that's going to move a column, it's possible we don't need a gang of 38 guys to move that column anymore. We can do it with 4. And some of us would think that's really sad. But the fact of the matter is technology provides more opportunities for more workers. And as unions lose membership across the country because their industrial base is leaving them, there is an opportunity for them to embrace technology. Unfortunately, they're trying to capture it. The Uber example is a perfect one. Here is Uber and Lyft as a substitute. This gig economy that we see growing is a product that developed because of the taxi monopolies and because of the cost of the taxi schemes and the medallions. You know that how much does a medallion cost in New York City for one taxi driver? Does anyone know? $250,000 would be cheap. I'd take that. You know, I talked to a taxi driver who said he had to pay $750,000 for that stamp on the hood of his taxi cab. And now my daughter sits there with her little cell phone and sees a little car driving by her house and hits a button, and that car stops and picks her up and takes her to work or takes her to where she needs to go. In Seattle, instead of embracing Uber and Lyft, the Seattle City Council said that they're going to force every single Uber and Lyft driver to be forced into a collective, and they're going to unionize them. And they're going to create another taxi monopoly out of an entrepreneurial response to a monopoly. Union officials just don't get it. If they went out and provided benefits to those Lyft workers and those Uber workers, they could use technology to dramatically increase their membership. They choose not to do that because they're steeped in this 1930s industrial labor policy that is designed to keep people out, to create barriers to entry in a monopoly marketplace. The guilds of the 1900s, the cigar makers and the window glazers, these were all designed to limit access to work. And instead of allowing more people to come in and create more opportunities and more jobs, union officials have kind of hung on with their fingernails to that guild system, to that caste system, to that monopoly system. And unfortunately for them, technology is working around. As the doctor said, technology is increasing dramatically, day in and day out. Union officials will survive because they will embrace technology, not because they'll try to stop technology. With that, we would take some questions. I know we're limited on time. I think the Secret Service is going to come in and force us all out of here very quickly. So someone has a great comment or question about technology and labor reform. Yes, sir.
What about in the professions, legal profession, medicine, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, you know, that's a great point. The service industry is really where their stock and trade is now. Government sector and service industry, their fight for 15. I suspect that, you know, the legal industry at some point will have an opportunity to unionize. Mostly lawyers in most government systems in California are unionized. They bargain collectively. The public defenders and the others are represented by unions. I don't see that as a tremendous growth industry. In fact, I see unionization in the government sector being more of a diminishing opportunity for organized labor because of the financial issues.
And with regard to the legal profession, artificial intelligence has reached the point where a lot of the work and discovery can be done now by the artificial intelligence. And so you're going to have this cross pressure where people are going to try to hold onto their jobs, and maybe through attempted unionization might be one of the ways that they would do it.
Yes, sir, back here.
I would ask, given the dynamism that technology brings and how rapidly industries tend to change, I would be curious on your thoughts on how you, on retraining the workforce, what exactly your ideas would be.
Look, we need to have a decent educational system that deals with this kind of thing. And what we've had a tiered system where it's sort of like you go to college or you don't go to college, and people the whole idea that it's a college diploma that counts, rather than my father, he had an associate degree from Georgia Tech in textile engineering, in fact, and that's fine if that's what you're going to go to. We need to think more about training people for the appropriate jobs rather than some sort of pie in the sky idea that everybody necessarily should go through and get a bachelor's degree or even a master's degree.
I think, from my perspective, the union apprenticeship program is a perfect example of what they can be and what they should be. They're providing that type of training to guys who are framing up houses and townhouses and building new buildings. That's exactly what they should be doing and offering that service. They tend to address the apprenticeship program, and they've allowed government to enter in, and the government funds it, and you have to be a union-only apprentice shop in order to get funding and all this. They've used this monopoly again to kind of protect it, as opposed to looking at it as an opportunity to expand their presence and train more workers and create more union members, frankly. Great question. Yeah, we had another one. Yes, sir, down here.
How can we get rid of government worker unions?
Well, I've got an answer for that. Do you want your colleague to answer that first? Because my answer is very short and very simple.
You go.
Well, the gold standard is Virginia. The Commonwealth of Virginia has very, very effective unions for firefighters and teachers, and they're very aggressive in Richmond. They go to Richmond every year. But you know what? There's a statutory prohibition against recognizing unions for purposes of bargaining in the Commonwealth of Virginia. It passed in 1993. So they can go down to Richmond and they can talk like all of us can get together and go to Richmond with a sign saying, raise our taxes. I don't think anyone here would do that, or lower our taxes or whatever, and we can redress our government in that manner. But in Virginia, you can't recognize a private organization for purposes of bargaining. That's the gold standard of how our government should work. Allowing a private organization between taxpayers and elected officials is not a solution. Wisconsin is beginning to realize that. Iowa, just last week, made dramatic changes to their labor policy. Our solution is eliminate bargaining. Don't eliminate unionism. Anyone can join a union if they want, and that union can go to Richmond or a state capital anywhere in the country and redress their government, but recognizing them with monopoly power is not the solution. Taking away that monopoly power is how we we basically manage that relationship and how we get our governments back.
And remember, the government employee unions, FDR was against them.
Yeah.
The AFL-CIO was against government employee unions. These things didn't exist when I was born. They were created later. And to show you the political impact, correct me if I'm wrong, but as I recall, there were 130,000 people who chose not to be members of unions once the reforms were passed in Wisconsin. 130,000 people. That's $1,000 a year dues. That's $130 million a year. That's $650 million over 5 years. Do you think it might have affected the outcome of the election in Wisconsin if the unions had had another $650 million?
Yeah, it's good stuff. And you can find more information about this in Capital Research Center's Labor Watch. You can find that for where this gentleman works, and they've got great information about labor unions and their power. Yes, sir.
How do you spread the ideas of free markets when a lot of the progressives argue for $15 minimum wage, arguing now to increase wages because somehow increasing it per hour increases the wage even though they cut the hours? How do you spread the idea against that argument?
When I was 10 years old, my dad was in the union, and I somehow figured it out and explained it to him, that the minimum wage, so-called, doesn't actually require you to pay anyone the minimum wage. It simply says you can't pay someone less than that. So if you have somebody who's worth to an employer less than $18.50 an hour, and how many young people starting out with no skills are worth that much? That just means they don't get that job. And if you don't get that first job, then you're not going to get that second job, and you're not going to get the experience that you need to move forward. So, to me, it isn't that hard to explain to people why minimum wages are harmful to particularly unskilled workers more than anybody else. It's just that a lot of people aren't making the effort.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the idea of setting a wage rate is just, I think the argument over that is more, it's we talk about topsoil. Topsoil helps seeds grow, but it's only about that much of the soil. And the idea of this minimum wage and fight for 15 is really it's a topically appealing argument, but when you dig down in it, it just doesn't work. It can't work. It will put people out of work. My first job was, I think I was a $2.35 an hour New York minimum wage worker at a grocery store, and I thought that was great. And I don't know if I provided that much value to my employer, but I appreciated the minimum wage at the time. But now I understand. I mean, as a small business, we at the National Right to Work Committee, we have lots of employees. The idea of raising the cost, of labor, somehow doesn't affect the cost of doing business or basically impinge on the profit motive that gets people to invest capital, to risk capital, to create value and to create growth and to help people feed their families. I mean, it's just completely blanking out on how the process works. It makes for good nightly news stories when people are out in front of the McDonald's yelling and screaming for $15. This is what I found about human nature. Everybody is jealous of the man who makes $1 more than them, and they're paranoid if the person makes $1 less. And so when you understand that, you understand that wages is a very difficult issue, and it's something that we need to be more instructive on and make the case better. But there's really no support for artificially raising wages without a corresponding value.
One of the things I say to reporters is, I think reporters, I really love reporters. So reporters should get $100,000 a year, that equivalent in a minimum wage. And then they go, but I would never have gotten my first job as a reporter if you'd had that. Oh, really?
We have another question, I'm sure. And if you don't think of it right now, I know you have a question. Don't be scared. Don't be scared. You have a question over there. Is that an Atlanta Braves hat?
Yes, it is.
Okay, well, you got to ask a question about the Atlanta Braves. I mean, what about collective bargaining in Major League Sports? I mean, we talk about this equality in collective bargaining, but yet who's the highest paid player on the Atlanta Braves team? They got a big contract there somewhere, don't they?
Probably Ken.
And he's making. Oh, that's right. And he's really I won't comment on him. I'm a Nationals fan, so we got a payroll that's pretty big too. Jason Worth at $23 million a year. Come on, And on the other hand, this union that says they're fighting for equality has a minimum salary for $500,000 a year for Clint Robinson, who's probably hopefully going to make the team. I like lefties first basemen, but this whole idea of the union in the Major League Sports is kind of an interesting phenomenon. Remember, in football, they had to decertify the union in order to get a contract for the highest paid players. But yet these union officials stand up and pound the table about equality when one guy's making $23 million and someone's making $500,000. Where's the equality in that? Yeah.
I remember George Will, of course, big baseball fan, and he wrote a column. It was a few years ago, so I don't know if the numbers are exactly the same now. But it was something like that the top baseball player was 23-40, whatever the $1 million number was that for the top baseball player, but that the median baseball player made $10,000 a year. because you've got to include all those people who are in the minor leagues and the minor leagues. And when you throw all those people in, you see, talk about income inequality, and then that's something you get there, certainly.
Yeah. Well, I think we've met our requirement. The staff told us we had to vacate by 5:30. They haven't come in here and hooked us yet, so we'll stick around if there's another question or comment. Otherwise, oh, yes, sir. Good.
So when do we actually see these cities getting punished for their, fight for 15 and all that? I mean, and by punished, I mean, there is no more dollar menu. Your
Right.
Starbucks is now gonna cost $10.
Great case study right now is CPAC, the village of CPAC, where they did the $15 and they did it for hotel and fast food. I mean, you look there, the exodus of small businesses from right around the airport in Seattle, you're seeing exactly what's happening, the ramifications of that. I suspect that that's going to happen wherever they try to get this done.
Well, it affects me because I live in the city of Washington, D.C., and they've already basically made it impossible for fast food places to operate other than a few that are grandfathered in most of the city. And now they're doing this thing with the scheduling where, if it's a restaurant, you have to tell people like a week ahead of time what their schedule is, which is just impossible if you run a restaurant. The local McDonald's I think the prices at McDonald's have gone up, in the 4 years I've been there, they've gone up about 50%. And that's what happens. And so there are people like me who depend on eating at places like McDonald's, and we just won't be able to stay in places like Washington. So you're going to have cities with a lot of, like San Francisco, where it's almost all rich people. Maybe there are a few poor people there that are on welfare or something like that to provide the votes to keep the politicians in. But mostly it's going to be for wealthy people in those cities.
Yeah. So the punishment is already occurring in places where they're trying to do this, unfortunately. And we don't hear those stories. We hear the stories when they pass it, but you don't hear what happened. The rest of the story, as Paul Harvey used to say. No one remembers Paul Harvey. You remember Paul Harvey? Bless your heart.
I met Paul Harvey.
You met Paul Harvey, okay, yeah. Paul Harvey was a radio commentary, and he always finished, "Now you know the rest of the story." And he would tell you the impact of things that happened. And as a young boy waiting to go to school, we would listen to Paul Harvey, and he would say, "Now you know the rest of the story." In Seattle, in SeaTac, that village, after that city council passed this minimum wage, jobs are fleeing. People can't find jobs now, and restaurants aren't there to serve people. So the punishment's already occurring.
Yeah, and I love bookstores, but every time I see a story of some little lefty bookstore, and they support all the lefty politicians, and now they're going out of business because their friends, the politicians, have raised the minimum wage or whatever the regulation is. It's sad. It's sad. I wish that weren't true.
Yes, sir.
Does hiking the minimum wage like that create a black market in labor?
Well, it probably does, but black markets by definition are unseen and unknown, but I think it does. But then again, you have labor policy, you have labor laws that have grown dramatically. The power of government to impose penalties on employers for behavior like that has grown astronomically under the Bush administration, yeah, that was Freudian, but it works, under the Bush administration and the Obama administration. I'm not afraid to say that here, by golly. I'll look right into the camera and say that. But no, under the Obama administration, the Department of Labor's enforcement, for example, OSHA enforcement. Thomas Perez, who may be the chairman of the Democratic Party by the end of Saturday down in Atlanta, he actually allowed union organizers to go on OSHA visits with OSHA inspectors in companies and look around and take notes and meet people and then of course as Steve mentioned, the joint employer status, where basically mom and pop McDonald's franchise owner can now basically hold the corporate company liable for labor policy, which creates this, who's got the deepest pockets to be sued, and it creates this it's going to put franchisees out of business if they enforce it.
And basically it puts pressure on McDonald's. If you're going to have consistency across the country, well, might as well allow the unions in, because it's the only way to operate.
So I think there probably is a black market, but we're not supposed to know about it. But obviously in every system where government imposes these types of regulatory constraints on the market, somehow, some way, technology either improves or a market creates itself that fortunately will have to, at some point, will be regulated, be found out, and be punished.
And certainly in regard to avoiding all the taxes on employees and all that sort of thing, I seem to recall people asking me to pay them in cash a lot, and I think there's a reason for that. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm so sorry I came in late, but I'm a small business owner. I want to know what I can be doing to actually fight against this. I don't know if you already outlined that, but I
We went through a 32-point plan, and we just finished on point 29. So no. You know what? We'll be glad to answer it. I think we're getting the hook. Are we getting the hook right now? Come on up here and I'll talk with you. That'd
Yeah.
be great.
And you can support organizations like Right to Work and like CRC,
Yeah.
because we're out there fighting for
So
this.
you now have qualified for your early access card. You may go. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.